Hey, y'all. So today we're going to continue on our study of cities and urbanization. We're going to start off with talking about the different types of housing with regards to the different levels of density and how those housing characteristics represent different patterns of land use. Then we're going to focus on a very important principle called smart growth or new urbanism and how cities are being changed and being expanded differently than in the past. So to start off with, I got a question for you. What are some things that you can decipher when you look at a specific city? Okay, so some of the things that I think of when I think about a city are things like skyscrapers, or I think of public transportation, or lots of new places to eat. But the where you are, where a city is in the world, is going to determine what are some of the characteristics that it has. So a couple of examples here. All right, this on the far left side, we have Tokyo, Japan. Obviously, what we see here is the density level of the city is very, very high. Lots of entertainment, lots of places to eat, lots of opportunities for people, but very crowded. On the right-hand side, we have a city in Africa. Definitely, this is a market center. We can see the exchanging of goods and services and things in this particular area. Definitely not as modern as the Tokyo or as Tokyo, but still very important center for trade, for communication, for the economy. So just certain areas of the world where they're located helps to determine, the services that are offered there. Okay, so when we talk about the density of an area, this is a throwback from Unit 1. Density is just basically the numbers. How many, is it people per square unit of whatever it is measurement? So it could be people per square mile, it could be people per square kilometer, it could be apartment buildings per unit of measurement, whatever. It's dealing with a number and a certain area. So when we think about the density of places in cities, we look at things like residential buildings. How many different residences are there offered in certain cities? Certain places offer better affordable housing than others. If we think about the cities in the developing world and those periphery countries, we think about those slums, those shanty towns, and places where housing is definitely a challenge. But if we think about a picture like what we see here, these apartment buildings here are definitely capable of giving a lot more people a place to live. And so these buildings, as well as the patterns of land use, reflect a culture, a city's technological capabilities, their development level, and a process called infilling. So infilling is basically where a city takes the open space that they already have and tries to use that open space for economic opportunity. So you can see here in this picture that this used to be pretty much all a park, okay? Open space, not really used area. But this city has created this open space and has created these residential areas, these small multi-family housing units that would allow more people to live into an existing city block. So instead of having to sprawl on the outside of the city to create housing, kind of using space that they already have to convert that into housing. Now, there's some positives and negatives to this. Obviously, the positives would be it would give people more of an opportunity to live closer to the city, made costs go down for commuting and things like that. But at the same time, there's some negatives here. I mean, you're taking away an ecological impact here. You're taking away a park. You're cutting down trees and stuff to build up an apartment complex. So there's definitely some positives and negatives to infilling. All right. When we talk about what are some examples of high density places of residence versus low density places of residence, obviously this very, very large high rise apartment building is going to classify as high density. There's a lot of people in a small amount of area compared to, this large detached house. This represents low density housing. Probably one single family lives in this space. The yard is bigger, more space per person compared to this high density, high rise apartment. Now, high rise apartments, depending on the level of development in the country, they can be very, very expensive and swanky, like some of the things that we see in New York City, or they can also be slums, like we've seen early 1900s New York with the tenement houses. So somewhere in the middle here, we have what's called medium density housing. A townhouse is a great example of medium density housing. Townhouses are places where multiple families or multiple people live in a certain area, but there's different segments divided off for those particular families. So the density of a place really helps to shape the type of building that's going to be there in a city. Okay, so our next topic is all about infrastructure and how that infrastructure relates to things like politics, society, and the environment. So when we hear the word infrastructure, infrastructure is basically any way that people can be connected. So it's roads, it's airports, any kind of communication system, water, sewer. And the level of infrastructure in a place is usually reflective of the level of development of an area. So, for example, here in the United States, we typically don't have to worry about the conditions of our roads or the conditions of our railroads or the conditions of our water systems and sewer systems. Now, I know there's some exceptions to that, but if you think about the developing world, does the developing world have adequate access to clean water, or do they have adequate access to sewer systems? Does places in the developing world have large arenas for sporting events? Do they have adequate health care? All of those are infrastructure examples that are closely connected with economic development of an area. And so the more developed an area is, the more examples of infrastructure that a place has. Okay. The location as well as the quality of a place's infrastructure affects its spatial pattern of economic development. So, for example, if you look at the image of this particular city here, okay, probably this area is going to be a little bit more developed, and we can tell that because there's a bus system, there's a sanitary sewer system, there is looks like some kind of public event center. There are wells there. There's storm drains. There's streets. There's bike lanes. There's over/under crossing for bicycles. So there's a lot of examples of infrastructure in this place. This is in Davis, California. And so this shows us that this place is very developed because they've got a lot of examples of infrastructure to keep their town clean and to keep their town user-friendly. Okay, so the next topic is on urban design and how different patterns of urban design shape different practices in cities, especially with cities that are either undergoing change or are growing. And so one of the things that geographers really focus on, particularly with this new era of modernization and urbanization, is something called smart growth. And so smart growth is all about trying to limit urban sprawl or suburban growth, trying to limit a city's impact on the existing landscape outside of the main area of the city, as well as to preserve farmland. I mean, if we think about it, we know in America that about less than 2% of all Americans identify themselves as farmers. But it's still important that they have adequate farmland to make sure that all 320 million of us are fed. So some sustainable design initiatives for these smart growth policies include something called new urbanism. New urbanism is all about having walkability, meaning you can walk from one place to the other in your city and basically maintain or get anything that you could possibly need. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody's going to be able to walk to the football stadium in the center of town, or that everybody's going to be able to walk to the opera center in the center of town. But it does mean that it has streets, walkable streets where housing is close to shopping centers, and public spaces are accessible to all housing areas. So having walkable blocks is all about new urbanism. Green belts are a type of phenomenon that we find a lot in the UK, okay, which is the United Kingdom. And green belts are basically undeveloped pieces of land that are legislated by urban communities to help prevent sprawl. So certain areas like parks or forests or things like that are preserved by cities to help prevent the expansion of suburban area and to give people a nice little sense of refuge. Another example of smart growth is something called slow growth cities. This was something that actually was started in Italy, and slow growth cities are trying to limit the problems associated with this massive growth, as well as to improve sustainability. When we looked at our video the other day about Dhaka, Bangladesh, Dhaka is a city that is growing so fast that its infrastructure, its government systems, and all those things cannot keep up with the amount of population growth. So slow growth cities are all about how can we curb this expansive population to make sure that we can be sustainable in the growth of our city. So a couple of goals of sustainable design initiatives is basically to make sure that development is compact, so it's not sprawling out into the surrounding areas, so that it protects rural land for things like agriculture, recreation, as well as wildlife, and to make sure that development is contiguous, make sure that development is close together. So a couple of examples in the United States. Oregon and Tennessee are both states that have set particular growth boundaries with their new development areas. So instead of trying to expand outward, they're trying to fill in areas of their cities that are already urbanized. That whole infilling thing that we talked about a little bit earlier. So trying to use spaces in the center of a city, maybe that have been run down, or maybe that were used for other purposes, and reconverting those areas to usable space for cities. And so the key here to have a sustainable city, you want to have a walkable area that can use both commercial, that can kind of tie in commercial and residential areas. And so that may include things like bike lanes or incentives for house renovations in the middle of the city, which is a term we're going to get to a little bit later called gentrification. So instead of building these huge complexes outside of the city, how can we remodel areas in the city? Maybe banning cars in certain parts of the city. There are places in the world, Paris is an example, where cars are banned from some parts of the city to make it walking friendly. And then also, just kind of making the city more walkable, more user friendly. So some initiatives here with sustainability. There's some praise for some of these initiatives and there's some criticism. So some of the praise for that is it reduces sprawl, urban sprawl and suburban sprawl, and helps cities to grow slowly and smartly. It improves walkability. That is a key important term to understanding this, making cities walkable, as well as improving transportation, encouraging people to use public transport instead of every single person driving their car in the city. Giving people a lot of different diverse housing options instead of having to live in, one style of housing, whether it be a townhouse or an apartment or a single family home, giving people opportunities to live in different, as well as improved housing options. And then improving the livability of a place. People are going to more likely want to stay in an area if it's a good place to live. If there's an area that they can raise a family, that it's safe, that it's clean, that they can get from place to place without having to be stuck in traffic for ages. Now, there are some criticisms also to sustainable design initiatives, to new urbanism and smart growth. A lot of times housing costs increase. If you are renovating an area, it's going to cost more to live there. And that sometimes displaces people that have lived in areas for a very long time, particularly minorities. This could lead to segregation. We mean separation of ethnicities or race in certain areas of the city. We'll talk about a little bit later how that has happened in America in the past. And then you could potentially lose the historic character of a place. If a building was built in the 1920s and we all of a sudden are trying to remodel it to, implement these new urbanism designs, we're going to lose that historic value of that building. And so that loss of place or loss of character can sometimes result from sustainability. Okay, so a very important term that we've talked about, we've mentioned several times, is something called urban sprawl. And urban sprawl is basically when cities start to expand over large areas and the suburbs are expanding. And so sometimes we see this as urban sprawl or suburban sprawl. Now, it can be a good thing because development has been brought to new areas, but it's also led to several different undesirable traits. So for example, to connect the suburb to the center of the city, you've got to build new roads. You've got to build utility. How are you going to get sewer systems out there? How are you going to get water systems to the suburbs? How are you going to get technology out there? So sometimes that cost of building things to the suburbs can increase the price of things. Wasting land in areas that could potentially have already been built in the center of the city, converting agricultural land to housing developments. How does that impact the local supply of what's available to buy in the grocery stores? How does that impact the vegetables, the dairy, the stuff that people buy if their agricultural land is being converted to housing? Transportation loss. If you're having to get a public transport system all the way out to the suburbs, how much money are you losing by that? Okay. So there's some steps that are being taken by several different places. In Europe, mainly, in the UK, we're seeing green belts being established to help prevent sprawl. And then smart growth policies in the United States are helping to prevent urban sprawl. So we're going to take a closer look at an example of urban sprawl, and that is in Las Vegas.
This is Las Vegas, Nevada. The sequence of images from space is from October 1984 to January 2009, as photographed by Landsat 5. They demonstrate the rapid spread of Greater Las Vegas into the adjacent desert. The population of Clark County, which contains Las Vegas and nearby cities, grew from 560,000 in 1984 to about 2 million in 2009.
It's definitely some examples of exponential growth and sprawl that's happened there.
From 1999 to 2009, the population increased by more than 1/3. Computing the differences between the first and last images in the sequence reveals where growth has been most intense. Lighter areas show more change. The city's core is dark, meaning it experienced relatively little change over the period. Most change occurred on the brighter outer edges. The same image reveals a significant drop in the Lake Mead Reservoir during this time. Growth demands attention to many factors that allow sustainable urban development: water resources, energy, transportation, land use, waste disposal, and the stewardship of the local economy.
All right, so we can see there just from that example of Las Vegas that urban sprawl reaches out not to necessarily the central business district in the center, but to the areas surrounding that. Okay, so if we look at in America, how can smart growth combat urban sprawl? So if we look at what smart growth is and some of the examples of that, smart growth encourages mixed use or mixed land use. And so there's a couple of key principles here that help to explain smart growth. And number one is mixed land uses. And that's, using the land for a variety of different reasons, using it for recreation, using it for housing, using it for commerce, taking advantage of compact design, getting as much things in a certain area as you can. A wide range of housing opportunities and choices, giving people options of where to live, not just, the same type of building or the same type of apartment every single place you look. And then this walkability, that is a huge thing. We see that walkability term used when we talk about smart growth and new urbanism. Creating walkable neighborhoods where people can get from one place to the other and not have to get into their car. Preserving space, giving people transportation choices. All of those are great examples of smart growth. Get back through here. Okay, so new urbanism is an example that uses smart growth, and it's basically a planning and development approach based on how cities have been able to convert their areas to walkable blocks and streets. There's that term walkable again, with housing options like what we see here in the image, close to shopping options, close to recreation centers, close to places where if somebody wanted to, they could walk out of their house and be able to be accessible to just about any of these other facilities and not have to get into their car. That's an example of new urbanism. So new urbanism focuses on what's called human-scaled urban design. Here are some examples of green belts. So here's the city of London, okay, very large city, world city. The areas that you see in green around the city have been designated areas by the United Kingdom as either forested areas, recreational areas, or agricultural land use. And the point of this is to help prevent the sprawl outside of the city of London. Now, does that mean that there's not cities located in these green belts? Absolutely not. There are, of course, cities located there. But London, if you look from this image up here, has spaced out its area of green areas, so for forests or natural resources or things, in between the different cities or the different farms there. This is a typical city in the United States, and we can see how sprawling, how a city has just sprawled outward, and there's really no kind of protection from that suburban sprawl. So smart growth and green belts help to stop this type of activity and lead it more into this type of expansion. All right, so that is all for today. Thank you for tuning in. Please let me know if you have any questions.